Many thanks, Luciano. That was a fantastic basis for the conversations that will follow, and I think has brought us absolutely up to date with the scale of the challenge that we are facing. So I'm going to begin with, from among our three distinguished panelists, by asking Ayaka Suzuki, who is the Director for Strategic Planning and Monitoring Unit in the Executive Office of the Secretary General at the UN. Tell us a little bit about your role, Ayaka, and in particular, how do you use anticipation of emerging technologies in your role?
Great, thank you. Great to be here. So I've been in this role since 2017, and my unit was freshly created with this Secretary General, partly based on lessons learned from the past. And so what I do, my title really doesn't reflect what I do. So one key responsibility is to serve as a secretariat for Secretary General's cabinet decision-making mechanisms, executive committee, senior management group, which he really emphasizes evidence-based decision-making. On the other hand, I'm also a focal point. Our unit is a focal point for emerging technology, and also responsible for driving what we call UN 2.0 transformation process. So that UN 2.0, what we mean by that is upskilling UN's capabilities in data, digital, innovation, behavioral science, and strategic foresight. And in that capacity, I'm also overseeing the Secretary General's Innovation Lab, Global Pulse, and Futures Lab network. And last but not least, I'm also overseeing Secretary General's work on a scientific advisory board. And this board, which was recently created, is really putting science at the center of decision-making and policy-making of the United Nations. And in a way, it makes sense in my mind and colleagues who are working with me to put normal decision-making processes of a big organization like the United Nations, and also be working on emerging technologies and innovation. And your question was on how do you put strategic foresight. So slowly and gradually, we are trying to inject strategic foresight in the work of these the secretariat that prepares for these meetings. And one of the mechanisms, which I didn't mention, is it's called Regional Monthly Review, which is a prevention mechanism. And we are looking at how we can inject more future thinking and strategic foresight into this work. So it's still work in progress, but we're experimenting, and then we're really seeing how we can get out of kind of the box of the present and firefighting mentality.
Sounds really exciting, Ayaka, thank you. And I've had a little bit of contact with some of the Foresights teams in the UK government, which draw heavily on a science and engineering background, and that's been really exciting to see that really kind of coming up. So on the topic of inventing the systems and infrastructures and networks that we need for the future, I'm going to come to our second panelist, Dr. Stephen J. Toope, who is President and CEO of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. So we'd love to hear a little bit more about the work that you do with the Institute, Stephen, and particularly why the Institute's approach is a little bit different from many of the other organizations responsible for supporting and enabling research right now.
It's a real honor to be here, and thank you for inviting me. CFAR has existed for 40 years, and right from the beginning, it was designed to convene some of the world's most brilliant people across all disciplines and at all career stages to advance transformative knowledge, but also to attempt to solve some of humanity's biggest problems. It doesn't fund the underlying research. We rely on national research organizations and foundations and others to do that, but essentially it builds networks of incredibly talented people across disciplines, across geographies, and it invests over time. Currently, we have 15 different programs, 2 programs in quantum information systems, quantum materials, program in humans in the microbiome, the future of cities, a program called Learning in Machine and Brains, and I'll say a little more about that because that was a program which really is the inheritor of our very first program 40 years ago, which was called Artificial Intelligence, Robotics, and Society. And one of the key players over the years just won the Nobel Prize for his work on neural networks, still very much involved in CFAR. Of course, we're very proud of that. But what I think is also important is there's been a real commitment to intergenerational talent building. And we have a series of programs that builds out opportunities for early career scholars, and in our case, often focusing on people who've just been appointed in their first academic appointments. And what's really different about this, I think, is that the model really asserts that you have to invest in people over time. We do, of course, assess the programs every 5 years, but we don't ask people to be constantly reporting about what they do. And we're asking them to address really fundamental questions that need to be addressed and that probably would be hard to get funded through normal funding mechanisms in governmental councils, etc. When I speak to colleagues who attend meetings, they will routinely say to me, this is the most important meeting of my year because it's the one that challenges me the most and causes me to think differently about what I want to achieve in my own work. And we now use Catalyst grants to bring out, when new ideas emerge in our meetings, which are very regular, we now can do seed grants immediately to try and get the new ideas mobilized, and then people can go out and build on that with larger grants from other organizations.
That's fascinating, Stephen. Thank you so much. And there's a huge amount to admire, I think, in the approach that you've just outlined, not least the importance of recognizing that innovation doesn't happen on these short timelines. Maybe it did once, I doubt it. And also recognizing that innovation and insight does not respect our boundaries around discipline or nation or generation. So let's move on to our third panelist, Professor Urs Gasser, who is Professor for Public Policy, Governance and Innovative Technology at the Technical University in Munich. So we would love to hear a little bit more about your work, please, Urs, and particularly what you would say are the main challenges for science and technology policy, given all the many and accelerating developments from research.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. And thank you, Luciano, for a fantastic presentation. I'm sure we'll return to it. So my day job is I serve as a dean at a new school, formerly known as faculties, we call them schools, that tries to build a bridge between the social sciences on the one hand side and technology and the sciences on the other hand, essentially breaking down some of these disciplinary silos that you mentioned and doing so in the field of research, understanding or acknowledging that in the world we live in, it's not good enough anymore to just invest in breakthrough science and developing powerful technologies, but that we need to integrate innovation we need from a societal and social perspective in parallel, that we need to think in parallel about the societal, ethical, regulatory, economic consequences of the technologies and sciences we advance. And so that's the project. We also build new programs so that future engineers, computer scientists, you name it, have a more robust understanding and a kind of a navigation aid, how the powerful skills and tools that are a part and at the core of their studies are some sort of playing out in a larger societal context, also actually where we need to bring the best technologies to address some of the world's biggest challenges. And if I may just answer your second part of the question briefly related to it, I think the list of challenges and opportunities is long when it comes to science and technology policy. I would say perhaps the biggest one goes right back to what Professor Floridi was sketching, which is we have to make decisions under conditions of uncertainty and complexity. And I think the truth is we have to do so despite the wealth of evidence, as we've heard from Professor Floridi, often by flying in the dark. So take the example of AI right now, and AI national policies, but also regulations like the AI Act. More often than not, we don't even have a good understanding of what the actual problem is we're trying to address, nor do we necessarily know what the best policy instruments are, given that many of these questions are frontier issues. And so a big challenge, I think, for all of us is if we make policy decisions without evidence, because the questions of tomorrow look different from those of yesterday, what does that mean for the governance of our own decisions? And how do we ensure, as we learn going forward, we can revisit our decisions and revise our policies and laws? And that's not easy because, as we all know, in the old paradigm, laws and policies were designed to stick and provide certainty and carry over in the future. And I think we need to reprogram both our policies and guardrails and institutions to set them up for rapid social learning and experimentation. I would say that's the biggest challenge ahead. Thank you.
That is a huge challenge for all of our institutions, I think, but particularly for these institutions where there is a policy-making function. And I think I feel that I saw that in play during the COVID pandemic. And I'm very interested, as you know, in the boundary between the scientists and the public. And what happened, in my view, during the pandemic was that more of the machinery of science-based policymaking was visible to the public. And it was quite baffling, I think, to a lot of members of the public. Who are these advisory committees? I've never heard of those people before. And they've been quietly doing good work in the background for decades, but nobody knew they were there until suddenly it was headline news in the UK newspapers. These really quite, I won't call them boring committees, I'll call them just very evidence-based committees. And I saw how destabilizing it was for public audiences to see that policy decisions are made with incomplete evidence, not usually at the pace that they were made during the pandemic, but always with incomplete evidence. And this brings me to, I would like to ask the panel to comment on the issue of public trust in science. There's a sense that public trust in science is becoming more fragile. I'm going to stick with you, Urs. I'm going to ask, what do you think are the most important factors that affect public trust in science?
It's a terrific question, and I don't want to steal more airtime here. So just very briefly, I think we are confronted with a paradigm shift, what even trust means and how we conceptualize trust. My strong sense is in the previous area, trust was about the functioning of technology and the science at work. Yeah, the airplane flies and doesn't fall from the sky, so that's building trust. But I think we're now entering a different area where it's no longer enough to build that kind of trust into the function by explaining how technology works, for instance, so like the science communication part. But we actually have to make a different case. That case is much harder to make, that actually these technologies and advancements will serve all people in an equitable way. So essentially moving from a functional understanding of trust to a fiduciary notion of trust to make the case this is serving people and the planet. And that's much harder, and I think we haven't figured that out.
I agree with you that we haven't figured that out, but it's the key challenge, I think, particularly for organizations involved in diplomacy and in science communication and such like. And Stephen, I know that you've given this a lot of thought. So what would you say are the main factors affecting? Do you see a change in public trust in science? And if so, how's that come about?
There's definitely a change. There's a lot of data that supports that. The Pew Trusts have done surveying in the United States, and where just a year or two ago, roughly 39% of the population said it had significant trust in science. That's dropped to 29%. That's in the US, and that's probably the worst case scenario in the world today for all sorts of complicated reasons. But the Edelman Trust Barometer would also tell us that although there's still a fairly high degree of trust in other parts of the world, it is diminishing. And I think there are many causes. I think you highlighted one. During COVID in certain countries, we saw the sausages being made. And that didn't inspire as much confidence as you might have thought, despite the fact that COVID was a wonderful example of rapid scientific innovation, the vaccine delivery, remarkable. But at the same time, it also showed that science is something which is deeply debatable. There are issues that scientists who are equally adept don't agree on. And I think a lot of people found that unsettling. But I also think it's a reason we have to be careful not to set up a dichotomy of scientific truth versus an ignorant population that doesn't get it. Because science, as you well know, is more complicated than that. There is disputation around how to interpret data and what causality is and what correlation is, as was made clear earlier. The second point I would make is I think we have to be really careful about over-promising the delivery of concrete results from basic scientific research. One example, and I may be a bit controversial, I have sat through so many presentations about so-called precision medicine and how it was going to deliver extraordinary new advances in human health. We've been hearing that now for 25 years, and of course there are advances, but at the same time, a lot of people have experienced their healthcare systems disintegrating or certainly getting worse in that same period. We have the same risk with quantum, it seems to me. We run 2 quantum programs at CFAR, and you have to be careful when we start making claims that we're going to deliver extraordinary new results for people when we haven't actually done a lot of the basic work. And it could be years before some of the applications that are being advanced actually come into to fruition. The last point I would make, and you mentioned it, Urs, is contextualization. But I think it goes farther than that. It's really building responsive science. And we heard about that, I think, very clearly on the panel this morning around coral reefs. There are many areas of science where we really have to ask the question, who's defining the meta question? And are we actually addressing the questions that the public wants to see addressed? And I think the answer to that is often no. And that really implies that all of us, and my whole career has been in the academic world, all of us in the academic world have to be better at listening, not just being in projection mode. So it's not just, to your point earlier, about educating people about science. It's also understanding that education is a mutual activity.
Fantastic, and I agree thoroughly with all those points, and particularly the difficulties we get into when science is kind of on a pedestal of being more accurate or more truthful or more foresighted or just more. And actually, so in my own experience, and it might be related to the UK education system, there might be some interesting case studies in the room from other systems. When we are at school, we are told that science is where the facts are made. And I think a lot of people leave school in the UK with this idea that scientists, when they go to work, they're just polishing the facts so they gleam a bit more brightly. The idea that they're working right at the edge of what is known is in contradiction to the key kind of takeaways from their formal education, their statutory schooling. So I think there's a lot of work to do to try and give people the opportunity to have a more accurate perception of how science is being generated, how these insights are reached, without destabilizing their trust. And I very much hope that our diplomatic institutions and organizations will have a huge role to play in this, which is what's prompted me to want to ask you, Ayaka, about what do you think the UN in particular, and its partner organizations can do to help strengthen public trust in science?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think I should just start by noting that when the Secretary General started his advisory board, scientific advisory board, he really wanted to look at this intersection of science and society, right? So he said, I want this board to really look at political, social, moral implications of science, because science exists in a context. And I really align with what my co-panelists have said already about how to institute trust in science. I think that, so the Scientific Advisory Board had its first in-person retreat last month, and they came up with the idea of releasing a public statement on trust in science because they think it's such an important topic. I mean, in a way, it's a paradox because I think science has never been so prominent in multilateral affairs. So, by the way, the United Nations member states have adopted the Pact of the Future in September, which is a very extensive agreement in 5 chapters, 2 annexes, including Global Digital Compact. It mentions science 50 times. It has its own chapter on science, technology, innovation, and digital cooperation. It's really, it's such a massive agreement. But and because science advances are not benefiting people equally. So inequality has already been mentioned, right? And there's also history behind science too. So it doesn't exist in a vacuum, this whole accessibility, who has access to science, we have and have nots. There are so many issues that really need to be tackled at the same time. So back to Secretary General's Scientific Advisory Board. So this statement on trust in science concludes with 6 action points. And I'm not going to list them all now, but one of them includes creating a local forum where local leaders can engage in conversation with scientists about these nuances of science. It's not really black and white, but it doesn't mean that it's not true, or it's the whole critical thinking process is going through them, and it's try to better understand what these breakthroughs mean. There's also, the huge endeavor, and this really is such a huge problem today, how to foster science in an information environment that is so challenging, right? Combating mis and dis and malinformation. So that itself is a huge challenge. Promoting science literacy is another key challenge. So on and so forth. But the point being is that it really is about fostering an ongoing conversation about this. It's not something that you could fix with magic wand. At least we have Pact of the Future as a starting point to start working on these issues. But I should also say that, ultimately, science is the only hope we have for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So what really we want to achieve is mitigating the worst, but really benefiting from what science has to offer.
That's great, Ayaka, and I love the positive tone. I think there's a danger with a panel on a topic like this that it could just be very depressing. And I don't want you to leave this session with a sense that there's no hope. Okay, so to hear these examples, these really good examples from all of our panelists actually, about the work that is being done to think about building a strong public trust in science is really, really helpful. And if you have other examples from other people's work that you'd like to give a shout out to, I'm going to come back to you in a second. I also want to make sure that we have plenty of time for audience questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll try and direct a microphone to you, starting over here if you don't mind. And then we'll work our way across. Also, I'm keeping an eye on if any of you are following the stream on Twitter, the platform formerly known as Twitter. If you use the hashtag, I might see your question there as well. Are there any examples of great practice you want to highlight? while we're here. So great practice around building scientific literacy, reaching public audiences, supporting scientists to think about the societal implications. Yes, Stephen?
Well, it's an example of how an area where we think a lot of negativity can arise, where something positive may come out of it. And it's a study out of Cornell recently about AI chatbots, which we often think of as really dangerous phenomenon, and they are in many ways. But what this study has shown is that AI chatbots are actually more convincing to most people than really seasoned debaters in convincing them about a particular topic. About 81% higher success rate in changing someone's mind than a real human being, even a trained debater. Now, you could look at that and say, that's terrifying, but you could also say, isn't it remarkable if we could deploy that in positive ways, and we could, then there's a chance of actually reaching people much more assertively than we can through normal channels of person-to-person communication.
That's a great example. And I've come across a related example also using AI chatbots. So there are an increasing number of non-profit organizations who work with people experiencing high levels of distress, people whose lives are in meltdown, and they are supporting traditional helpline services. So the first thing you speak to might be an AI chatbot because it's the middle of the night, but that's when you're distressed, etc. And actually, there's some really interesting evidence coming out that people, because they know it's not a real person, they're more likely to be honest with them about what the problems are and what advice and help they want. And actually, that enables the chatbot to do a more effective job than if you have to reveal your deepest, most embarrassing secrets to another real person. So that was a use case that I didn't see coming, which I think has real power. Now, over to questions. So yes, please.
Thank you, Elaine Franz, Flow in Action. I've heard echoes of it in all that you've said, but I just wonder around the certainty issue. When we talk about solutions, we often don't bridge the gap between how people seek to meet their human needs, their certainty on a daily basis. And amidst that so much uncertainty, how can scientists and science build that trust? Because it speaks to how people need to live their daily lives. How can they find jobs in this green transition? How can they feed their families? How do you feel about that?
That is a fantastic question. And do we have enough microphones to take a couple of questions at a time? So there's just one, as they say. We'll go in a big wave. I will come to you. Perhaps let's take another one, and then you have a bit of choice.
Thank you. Sarian Bowers, Head of Policy at the Wellcome Sanger Institute. This is going to possibly be slightly heretical, but is trust actually the wrong thing to be thinking about with all of this? Because I personally am not convinced that actually public trust is the sort of driver behind a lot of behaviours. The public don't trust Facebook, they don't trust AI, they don't trust lots of things, they still use them. And so I think it's a more complicated matter than just thinking about building trustworthy systems and trust. And I was just curious what the panel might think about that.
Yeah, two great questions. So which of you would like to respond firstly to people need certainty from scientists because they have to make decisions every day of their lives? And secondly, is trust the wrong thing to be focusing on anyway when it comes to behaviour? Who wants to go first? Ayaka, do you want to?
I mean, maybe I'll tackle the trust bit. Yeah. You know, I mean, trust is not really an end in and of itself, right? But if people don't trust science, and if they don't use science-based or evidence-based decision-making, that's where the problem lies. And that's kind of what we saw with the with vaccines, right? So, I mean, I'm not saying that it's trust is everything, but there is a correlation between people's trust in an institution or their decision making. So I think we do have a problem. So insofar as that, we need to tackle that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm happy to add a thought. Thanks for the wonderful questions, hard questions. Maybe one approach is to look more at the process of science as opposed to the outcome. So essentially that We don't expect that science can provide all the orientation to individual members of society, but that science can offer a protocol, insights into protocol, how we actually deal, for instance, with disagreement. One of the great things about any scientific setting is that we constantly disagree on almost everything that we're discussing. Whoever has ever attended a faculty meeting knows about it. And yet, we sort these different viewpoints and perspectives out in a productive way. And we have developed a fairly universal protocol among scientists how to go about it. And so one way may be actually to open up our campuses, our communities of practice, and invite citizens. And this would be my story that I would like to share. I'm institutionally part of a global network of centers that focus on technology and society issues. And that brings together a community of about 130 institutions around the world. And what we see is really a very different way to engage citizens in the formulation both of questions and answers, to go back to Luciano's slide, but also challenging the questions and challenging the answers that we produce. And maybe, so the trust, bridging to the second question, the trust is not so much in the outcome, or the value of science is not to provide substantive guidance so much alone, but really in the protocol, in the processes, in the practices that have something really compelling and are very different from religion, or you may take any other normative orientation system.
Stephen?
It's just amazing. I was going to answer in almost exactly the same way. I've recently done a book on how we can actually use a lot of the sort of great insights from philosophy of the past to help us overcome anxieties of our current day. And one of them is really the notion of communities of practice that's been developed over very, very long periods of time. And it's understanding that communities of practice are not just professional communities. They're inclusive communities that give people the opportunity to feel that they are part of decision-making processes. And the other aspect of that is actually calling into question some understandings of truth that cause people to believe that there is only one right answer. And if you go back to pragmatic philosophy coming out of the US mostly in the early 20th century, you've got an idea that truth is really the best knowledge that we have given the data in front of us at any given moment. And I think oddly, it might help people understand that we really can't create absolute certainty, but we do have frames that allow us to operate with enough certainty to make decisions at a given moment in time.
Fantastic. And I think, excuse me, I love that we're coming back to philosophy as a basis for some of our remarks here. The philosopher Honora O'Neill talks about how scientists can never ask to be trusted. That's not a thing you can ask for. All you can do is seek to be trustworthy and see what happens. So yes, another question, please.
I'm Tanvir Kabir, Counselor Political at the Embassy of Bangladesh in Berlin, Germany. I have one question for Professor Urs and one for the UN system. First question is about the rise of, right-wing politics globally. We often talk about, how to tackle it, and then, to me as a diplomat, I think there is also from our side globally, we don't have constructive science-based, evidence-based policies, or I should say that narrative to counter that rise of right-wing politics. My question to Professor Urs, what do you think about that? And second one is for the UN system. So when we talk about climate change, emissions, we talk about, but we often do not talk about the policies needed for management of natural resources management, natural resources, transboundary NRM. So it also gives rise to also right-wing politics. And then at the end of the day, people don't have trust on the UN system or international organizations that, we have evidence, scientific evidence, but if policies are not there, they don't work. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for that. And we'll take, thank you very much. We'll take another question as well, and we'll wrap them together. And I think, Urs, on the politics question, I feel like could be a whole other conference, but maybe we can focus in on what it means for science-based policy making. But question here, yes?
Yes. Hello, my name is Leo Eigner. I'm a researcher at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. And I'd like to thank the panelists for very stimulating discussions. I think it's definitely going in the right direction. I particularly like the focus on process and trust, opening up as a science community to society in general. I think this is probably the most important debate happening in this community. So I appreciate that. What I would like to ask is, I think we're facing a certain problem in terms of legitimacy, because science is the best system we have in terms of knowledge production, so that's good. But there's also national sovereignty, and it's a social process that ultimately decides. And it seems to me that a lot of the issues that we're facing politically, but also within science, stems from this tension. What is ultimately legitimate? Who can decide? And I think we agree that neither has full authority, but the question I would like to ask the panel is, how do you navigate that? How do you navigate the social or the sovereignty issue and the science issue? How do we have to change our institutions, our mechanisms, our way of thinking? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So, shall we start, Urs? Do you want to start on politics?
Wow, no small questions here. Thank you, two wonderful questions again. So I will caution what we expect the science system and scientific institutions be able to promise. Again, going back to your point, better don't overpromise what we can do. So I think that the question of polarization and the shift to right-wing populism, that's not something I would argue that the science system can tackle alone. I wouldn't say science doesn't have a responsibility, to the contrary, but I do think these are larger ecosystem challenges. Now, one specific contribution, that being said, I feel we can contribute from academia, from universities, is not only to stay at the description of the problem or analyzing, for instance, what's the impact of social media? Is social media causing radicalization or not? So there have been big debates and inconclusive evidence in some ways. So that's fine. But I think we need to do more. And we can do more. And I would just highlight maybe three possibilities very briefly. One is the way we teach our students, the way we interact with our students as some sort of ambassadors of change once they graduate and go into the world and make it better is a huge asset. We have a theory of change. It's our students that can make a difference and double down on commitment to democratic values. The second contribution we can make is to reach out multiplayers who think of journalists and reporters who have an important role to inform the public. How can we make the best, even tentative, as you pointed out, at a given moment, the best knowledge available? How can we make that accessible so that people understand in simpler terms what we know, what we don't know, and what the unknowns are? And the third contribution is, I feel we as universities could actually really team up globally. Imagine hundreds of universities interconnected to create a response system, a network when media manipulation or disinformation on a given topic takes over. Almost like in computer security, where we have CERTs, computer emergency response teams. Couldn't we team up as researchers to counter at a global scale the flow not of viruses in the computer science sense, but of fake news, like the ones which you just see now around the hurricanes in the US, where hundreds of millions of people start to click on news that the hurricanes were geo-engineered by the US government. And I think we as universities, we could debunk some of these rumors in a timely fashion, in a coordinated manner. So 3 ideas.
Great ideas. So some jobs for us all, I think, after this this conference. Ayaka, do you want to respond to the importance of policy for natural resources like minerals?
Sure. Thanks for the great questions. And I mean, I think climate change is a very good example of science-based policy making. I mean, although the results are not what we would all like to see, but I mean, the fact that this international panel exists, IPCC, that's really a model for many other things. So, for example, I spoke about the Pact of the Future, and the annex of the Pact of the Future is the Global Digital Compact, which is a huge section on AI governance. And one of the key recommendations, key decisions that was made is the creation of an international scientific panel for AI. That's a big step forward towards AI governance. So that being said, the one thing in scientific knowledge, scientific advice, another thing is the actual policy that results from it, right? And especially international policy, when you have over 190 countries negotiating the final text. I mean, there are gives and takes, and then the results will never be a purely science-based document as much as we would like to see it. So it will be an imperfect document from that perspective, but that doesn't mean that we should not provide the policymakers with the best science advice possible. So at least they're making an informed decision, right? Or to try to make the best out of it. And then just a quick point on this question about legitimacy. I think that's also hugely important. And then for us, that's why I think the United Nations is a very unique platform, because it is the only universal inclusive membership. And we, again, at the recent discussion of the Scientific Advisory Board, there was some discussion about that. I mean, let's face it, science has not been, there has been some dominant voices, right? And so capacity development of Global South, I think, is extremely important. Some of the scientists from Global South have said we should really try to work together to stop so-called parachute science, right? And then some might even say decolonizing science. And I think that's hugely important to level the playing field and to make sure that all different voices are heard and are part of this process that both Urs and Stephen have talked about.
I agree, and I think when it comes to legitimacy, it's important, I think, to remember that the politicians are the people who need to take the decision. For the most part, it's not normally a decision that can be left only to scientists. Where it is a decision for scientists, there are different mechanisms for that. There's a quote that I think is attributed to Winston Churchill about needing to have scientists on tap, like you turn the tap and they all fall out, and they're right there when you need them. Scientists on tap, but not on top. And I think that comes back to the point made maybe earlier in the session about not having complete information. The politicians are the one who take the risk, who step forward and make the decision. Ultimately, scientists can do their best to advise. This is what we would recommend. This is what the evidence says. But there are always going to be gaps, and therefore the decisions are for the politicians to make. Be interesting. I could see some nods and shakes, so maybe we'll have an argument about this later, which would be good. Stephen, do you want to comment on the question of legitimacy or
Well, I'd only add, I do think it's the right question. I think, legitimacy is a very, very broad issue, and it relates to the distrust in institutions, generally speaking, which has emerged in the last certainly decade and perhaps beyond. On the sovereignty question, I actually think it's profoundly difficult because we know more and more that science is a collaborative activity. It does require inclusive engagement. People call it a team sport. And yet we're in an era where increasing export controls, that came up in conversations earlier today, are getting in the way of collaboration. So too is research security protocols, which are evolving in many, many places for very understandable reasons, but we often get the phrase, small terrain of protection but high fences, and that may be right, it sounds right, but at the end of the day, if we really get into a position where we privilege sovereignty over the production of new knowledge in a very dramatic way over a long term, I actually think we will be living in a world where we are scientifically less successful. And we have to address that openly. One example of where it can work, to pick up on your idea of universities collaborating, when I was at Cambridge University, we worked with a number of universities to develop a network around climate change research, including Chinese universities. And that was just on the cusp of when things were getting difficult. But I know that if we couldn't collaborate with China on that question, we would not be producing the best science. And so, yes, I totally understand the importance of security concerns and intellectual property concerns and all of those things, but we have to find a way of collaborating across those concerns.
So if I can just say, yes, exactly. And I feel there is also a tremendous responsibility of university leaders. I think we also need to push back sometimes on what comes top down from national policies and national security interests at the cyber command level, and really hack in a way the system, how we can keep open communication channels exactly across geographies the way you described by example. I think in some sense I believe that the academic environment and community is in itself a laboratory to figure out how do we maintain legitimacy, how do we govern ourselves in a very messy, complicated geopolitical context. And if we are not able to figure it out, despite what we referred to earlier on, some sort of at least a universal protocol, how we typically interact with each other as scientists, who else should be able to do it? So at least we have a base to build upon. And I feel it's our responsibility, also given the special protections we have under many constitutions, to conduct research and have the freedom to teach, at least those of us who have this freedom to double down and always recreate such opportunities as you shared from the Cambridge example.
Some great recommendations there. Now, I need to take the final 3 questions. So if we could go here, and there's one on the front row as well. We're going to squeeze 3 in. You have to choose only one. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. My name is Michel Vetet. I'm ambassador of the Order of Malta, and I'm very interested to know, we have the Council of Europe Convention on Artificial Intelligence and Human Rights this summer. We had also the European Union Artificial Intelligence Act. And now, as you mentioned, Mrs. Suzuki, we have this Global Digital Compact. But then the question is, how do we use existing treaties and existing mechanisms to try to control artificial intelligence? So thank you very much again.
Fantastic question, great. So one on the front row, please.
Hello, thank you very much. This is really inspiring. I am Melissa from Sabancı University, and I was wondering, any of you can answer this, but what sort of values do we have to let go of? And which values do we want to change for an upcoming, more positively instigated future?
Fantastic. And this is why we started with philosophy, of course. So there's a question. There's a person with a microphone. Let's take your question.
I quote nothing of what you said so far, except of the importance of evidence and causality. So what about the standard model? Is it a causal law, a causal theory? The standard model is to CERN, where we sit, what the Holy Trinity is to the Holy See. So does it promote the idea of causality? It may contain some causal law, but that's surely not the way the CERN is communicating about that. It's more like an icon to kiss.
So I think there might be a lot of specialists in the audience who we might delegate that particular standard model question to. A choice of questions. Ayaka, I might invite you to respond to the question about treaties that we heard first, if that's okay. And then I would love to hear thoughts from Stephen and Urs on either treaties or values.
So on treaties, I mean, obviously existing treaties are still relevant. And we were doing some work on, for example, neurotechnology and human rights. We did actually very thorough mapping of existing treaties and of course, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, et cetera. And the conclusion that we reached was that we don't really need new treaties related to neural rights, right? Neurotechnology. We really just need to implement existing treaties, and also to make, there are many ways of establishing practices, so it's just really maybe clarifications, et cetera. So I think it really is context specific. There are gaps in existing treaties because, so for example, Outer Space Treaty from '67, right? That does not cover all the different areas of space activity today, not to mention the fact that at that time, there are virtually no private actors in space, and today there are many, right? So we do need to look at what the gaps are and address those gaps, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they would be treaty. More and more, they're kind of softer ways of governing these emerging areas. So all of this to say that absolutely we need to not ignore, but build on and implement, because a lot of times treaties do exist, but they're not implemented, and that's part of the problem. And but there are gaps, and we need to acknowledge that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Urs?
I would like to address the question of value, which I find extremely thought-provoking. And I think we need to double down on an old value and on a virtue, and that is self-constraint and humility. I think both personally as well as institutionally, including at the political level, we need more overreach protectors. We need to limit the own power we may have, and as we practice and exercise decisions, and be much more modest. And be aware, whatever we decide, that we actually may be wrong about it, and that others and other viewpoints may be ultimately right, and that this has implications, and we should only go so far if we have doubt that, and have a sense we may be wrong. And to me, that would be a value that may help us a lot in this environment that we described today.
Thank you. An uncomfortable feeling sometimes, but very important. Stephen?
Of course, any discussion of values will reveal one's own values very strongly. And it's very interesting because I would pick up exactly where you left, Urs. Humility, modesty, a listening posture, absolutely crucial because it relates to the point that I made earlier. If we understand truth as not something which is absolutely fixed and exclusive within a particular society, but potentially mutable, it's the best that we know now, given the ability we have to collect the data that gives us the information that allows us to make the truth claim. That's a profound, probably, shift in values for many societies. And of course, it does call into question interrelationship of societies and how they understand truth. But I think the humility and modesty becomes crucial. The second piece, and again, it reveals my own biases, I would say that one of the things we have to let go of is purely game theoretic understandings of human interaction. that it's not just about competing interests. All of the evolution in constructivist IR theory, in behavioral economics, I think these are really important developments that cause us to go back to more complicated understandings of human interaction and to eschew what is sometimes valued above all, which is the cleanest explanation, may just be wrong.
Mm-hmm. And I think, thank you for that. I think this really underlines to me the importance and the urgency of effective communication engagement between those working in diplomacy, those working in science, research and innovation, and those working with public audiences, particularly young people. And I want to thank this fantastic panel for bringing that out so clearly, and also to thank each of you, particularly those of you who asked questions, for helping us co-create such a wonderful panel. Before I let you go, I have a little bit of information to give you. So firstly, don't forget to use the GESDA Summit hashtag on social media. Another opportunity to raise your questions when I didn't come to you, sorry. I believe that as we leave the session, there will be a feedback form, a link to the feedback form displayed on the screen, and the organisers will be super grateful if you would take, they promised me it will be no more than 2 minutes of your time to fill that in with all your great ideas for the next time they do this. My penultimate point is that tomorrow's session, I hope many of you will join us for tomorrow's session, has a slightly earlier start at 8:45. So I look forward to seeing you there then. And most importantly, a point related to the very first question about certainty. So in some of my work with public groups, they say, oh, these scientists, they tell me something different every day in the newspapers. You know, one day red wine is bad for you, the next day it's good for you. And I say, don't worry, red wine is definitely good for you. And on that note, I invite you to join us for a drink in the Globe Theatre, which will be on 2 levels. That's not a metaphor, literally, physically. There's a ground floor and an upper level. So don't miss the party up high. Before I let you go, please join me in thanking our fantastic panel, Luciano, Ayaka, Stephen, and Urs.